Hello, evil minions. It is I, your mean and evil overlord. Hello, it is Monday, April 6th, 2020. And today will be your lesson for this week. We are doing Imperialism. The first thing you will need, if you have not gotten it already, is go to Google Classroom and download this document right here. This is a 3-page document. It's got this page, and then this page, which is a continuation, and then it has this notes page right here. You will need this before you go on with today's lesson. If you do not have it, go to our Google Classroom and download that sheet and either print it out and write in as you go, or just honestly just fill it in your Google Classroom as you go, and then just submit it to me that way. If you do not have the Google Classroom information, please go to my webpage on the Cross website. It has that information there. Join whichever class is appropriate for you. I have 2 classes, periods 1, 2, and 3, and then 5, 6, 7. Join the appropriate class, get all that information. Pause this video, come back to it if you need to get this document, but you will need that document for this lesson. All right, so with that said, let's talk about the age of imperialism. Now, last week in the Google Classroom, I submitted to you kind of an opinionaire that asked you a number of questions about the role that powerful countries like the United States should take in the world. Should we interfere with another country if it's for a good reason? Should we just mind our own business and stay away? Hopefully it got you to thinking about how countries interact with each other. Because during this age of imperialism, we are going to be examining the way powerful countries decided, you know what, we can just go and take what we want. And there's been a long history of that throughout the world. But as we get into the late 1800s and early 1900s, powerful countries start doing this on a much grander scale than has ever been done before. So we're going to look at this week. All right, so the age of imperialism is an interesting thing for a couple of reasons. It was thought that during this time, countries had run out of space. Everybody had expanded. The United States had reached its quote-unquote manifest destiny, and they were out of space. Countries in Europe had been fighting each other for hundreds of years over territory and land, and they finally got to the point where they're like, you know what? There is more land available to us if we think on a bigger scale. And here's where that thinking went. We're going to focus today on Africa. This will be part 1 of our imperialism discussion, and we're going to focus primarily on Africa. But major European countries and the United States started eyeballing the continent of Africa. Africa had been kind of a place. It had fueled the American slave trade and the slave trade for a number of countries around the world for quite a while. That had largely tapered off, but it wasn't necessarily finished. And we're going to talk about Africa because this is where imperialism started. Now, I talked too long and my auto advance went. So why would I bring up Africa? Well, that's where everything started when it comes to imperialism, for the most part, on a large scale. Now, why would European countries want to control Africa? Well, here's why. Africa is huge. And I know on our globes we don't really see it. It looks kind of like the same size as everything else. But if you actually take the land mass in square miles or square kilometers, depending on where you're from, and you superimpose countries over Africa, you can see just how big the continent of Africa really is. It will fit the United States, all of China, Japan, India, Eastern Europe, Italy, Germany, France, Spain, even the UK down here where Madagascar should be. Africa is huge. And for the most part, and we'll get into this later, Europeans and the United States, Europeans primarily, looked at Africa as vulnerable territory. So we will get into that today. So what is imperialism? Well, let's define it. The definition of imperialism is the conquering of foreign territories by powerful countries for natural resources and markets. Okay? Now, let's look at natural resources. Countries needed resources. The more populous your country, or the more populated your country gets, the more things you need. You need food, obviously. You need other things to make your society grow. During this time, steam engines were on the rise, even getting into combustion engines a little later on. But to make steam engines work, coal is a very necessary thing to have. So coal is a natural resource that was highly sought after. And of course, always gold, silver, precious metals, those were being sought. Ivory was a big thing back then, still is now, unfortunately. And so Africa was seen as a huge place to go and get the resources that you needed. You know, the thinking in Europe was, well, you know, Africa is a primitive culture. They're not using steam engines. What do they need coal for? Let's go get their coal. So natural resources was a big draw for these industrialized countries. Markets was also, I'm going to have to turn off the auto advance. Markets was also a big draw. You had factories and companies of all sorts in these industrialized nations who were trying to make as big a profit as possible. And the way you make big profits is to sell more products. Well, at some point, you reach the limit of the number of customers that are buying your product. So it's often thought that, oh, if we open up new places to our markets, that's new customers. So we are going to conquer this foreign territory, and then we will have all these extra people to buy our stuff, buy our clothes, buy our furniture, buy all these things that we're producing, and it's just more customers for us. So those two factors were the primary drive for imperialism during this time. Plus, it was also kind of a social status. You know, hey, look at us. Look at all the territory that we own. We are mighty. Fear us. All right. So there are a number of different forms of imperialism. We have colony, which means ruled directly by a foreign power. You know, we very early on, the United States, when we were colonies of Great Britain, that is a form of imperialism. During this time, a good example of a colony, a country that's ruled directly by a foreign power, would be Great Britain over India. In fact, India was known as the jewel in the crown of Great Britain at that point, just because of the natural resources. And Great Britain went into India, totally removed all government in India, and ruled India themselves. They did not sit back and let India rule itself as like if they were a protectorate, which means we're controlled by a foreign power, but you're allowed to keep your government in place. But that government answers directly to the imperial power that has taken them over. So we have colony, ruled directly by a foreign power, and a protectorate, which means we have moved in, we have taken control of your country, we're going to leave your government intact, but they answer to us. They are puppets to us. The third type of imperialism is the least intrusive. It's called a sphere of influence, which means the imperialistic country has moved in on a smaller, weaker country and said, hey, we're friends, right? We're going to, be your buddy, and you're not going to be buddies with anybody else. You're only going to deal with us for your trade purposes, for, all these other things that you might want to interact with the world on. You're going to interact with us exclusively. So those are the three forms of imperialism. Some are more direct than others. Certainly if you are become a colony where you are ruled directly by a government, that is pretty intrusive. So those are the three types that we will be talking about at various times. So we're talking about Africa. Let's look at an old map of Africa before imperialism. You can see in this a lot of this language. I think there's some Sanskrit or Arabic in there possibly. I'm not really sure. But this is an ancient map of Africa. And you can see that there's big swaths of desert here in the northern part and in the central region. But you also have populated areas along the coast. These are areas that attracted the foreign countries the most. And there are millions of people in this continent. It's like we saw earlier what a huge continent it was. And there are millions of people there. You have well over 1,000 languages and groups in Africa. It is a wide, huge, diverse continent. And it had a culture, many different cultures. And it had been there. I mean, that's scientists will tell you that is the cradle of life as we know it, originated somewhere in Africa, and it's been around for a long time. And for hundreds of years, they kept out Europeans. When technology was similar, Africa held its own. They kept Europeans out. Some of the greatest, if you'll remember, if you were here in Arizona last year for 6th grade, you learned about some of these great African empires, like the Egyptian Empire, and for thousands of years, the role Egypt played in North Africa, and how powerful they were. But it was only when technology in Europe and the United States started to outpace the technology of Africa with the mass production of guns and cannons and things like that, that the balance of power started to tip. And then once you had groups of people with machine guns, repeating guns, automatic rifles, things like that, coming in, fighting some of these African groups that were still using clubs and spears and things of that nature, the balance of power shifted. And so what you see is the start of imperialism. And really, up until this point, nobody knew much about Africa. And that was also part of the reason why they'd kept Europeans out. Europeans just didn't know. The only group that really knew about Africa were missionaries who had explored the interior. These are Christian missionaries who were trying to spread their religion, and they would travel throughout Africa, and it was really only missionaries that knew much about Africa for quite a while. Then something happened. It's called this Scramble for Africa, and it was initiated, kind of started by the small European country of Belgium. And you had King Leopold hires explorer David Stanley to explore the Congo, and you can see the Congo region here, and it is a huge area. And so they start exploring that area. They made treaties with local chiefs along the Congo River. They were trying to kind of ease their way in, learn about the area. And it was primarily King Leopold II who was pushing all of this. And he had ulterior motives, as you could imagine. All right. Ultimately, companies moved in to this area in the Congo, and what turned out to be the biggest natural resource was rubber. In Congo, they have rubber trees. And as the name implies, if you harvest the sap from a rubber tree and process it, it actually becomes a form of natural rubber. And with the expansion of machinery, rubber became in high demand as sealers to keep liquids in engines. And it was high demand for tires, for belts, hoses, all of these things that go in an engine that are best served by rubber. And they discovered natural rubber in this Congo area. So as the wealth started pouring in to Belgium from these rubber tree plants, the desire to get more and more and more expanded. And ultimately what happened is, over the course of about 40 years, you had millions of Congolese people butchered, maimed, tortured, abused by these Belgian companies exploiting that area. It is known as the Congolese Holocaust. And there are entire books that have been written about it, but it's not very widely known. But this was a brutal, brutal time. Other countries condemned Belgium for this, but at the same time, they started kind of going, yeah, that's not okay, but man, they're getting rich from this. This might be something we want to look into. And that was the beginning of the end for Africa during this time. So we get what, as I mentioned earlier, is the Scramble for Africa. Ultimately, as all these countries started exploring Africa, looking into the idea of its natural resources, you started to have these countries in Europe coming together and saying, look, we've got to figure this out. We are actually going to be fighting with each other for these resources, and we might actually end up in yet another war with each other over resources from Africa. Let's do this differently. And what they did was 14 European nations meet in Berlin for a conference in 1884. And they said, look, if we're going to be in Africa, if we're going to be taking control of Africa, let's do this the right way. Let's sit down, let's talk about it, let's figure this out like gentlemen. Instead of going to war with each other, let's just decide right here and now what we're going to do. they divided up Africa without any regard for the idea that there were actually already people living there and who had been living there since time began. Nobody from Africa, from these African nations, were invited to this Berlin conference. It was strictly European countries. And they all got together and basically said, okay, you'll get this part, you'll get this part, we'll get this part, and we all agree that we're good, right? No need to go to war, no need to hurt each other for this. We're good, right? And that was the Berlin Conference. No regard for Africa, no regard for the people there. They basically just saw Africa as, well, we already know this belongs to us because we want it, and they can't stop us. They can't do anything about it, the people who live there. They are technically inferior to us. They don't have the technology that we do. They do not have, the education that we do. And they really considered people of Africa just to be basically mindless savages. And some of the political cartoons of the day really show the contempt for the people of Africa. Very unflattering caricatures of the people who live there. And it was basically considered, look, this whole continent is ours for the taking, and we're going to do that. And they did. And here's what it looks like when they were done. You can see that for the most part, they allocated huge sections of land in Africa for these European countries. Now, there were a couple of instances where some areas in Africa resisted imperialism from Europe. Most notably, Ethiopia, right over here. They resisted incursion. Egypt was technically independent, but there were still Brits there who occupied that. They left Liberia alone. Liberia, if you'll recall from our Civil War unit, was where a lot of former slaves from America had come back to Africa, and they create, the country of Liberia was created for those individuals. So that was left largely alone. But as you can see down here, a lot of these countries just came in and said, this belongs to us now. Belgium, Great Britain, France, Italy, Portugal, Spain, all of those, and even you had some German groups there, but all of these countries just came in and said, hey, you belong to us now. It's really not okay. Yeah, we are already. So how did they justify this? Because all during this time in the late 1800s, if you will recall from our Progressive Era unit, there was this move to be better people and to right wrongs and to, become better, more conscientious people. So how do you justify taking over an entire continent? Well, Europeans and Americans believed it was their responsibility to spread Christianity. This was one of the reasons that was given for expansion into Africa. It was the basic concept of, Africa is filled with a bunch of heathen savages. They don't know anything about God, and it's our duty as good Christians to spread that word. So they moved in to Africa on a large scale, one of the reasons being Christianity. Another was to civilize and educate these nations in Africa. They basically said, hey, look at us. We're living the good life. We've got all this technology. We've got all this wonderful life. And here you have these poor Africans, living in huts, being eaten by lions and stomped on by elephants. And oh my God, their life is so pathetic. It is our duty to go in and help these poor people, to educate, to bring them civilization, to bring them God. And man, aren't we amazing? Oh, and we're also going to end the slave trade because, we're good people and we're going to do that. Oh, sure, we will absolutely steal anything of value from that entire continent in the process, but that's really not why we're there. We're there to teach them to read. And we're going to steal all their rubber tree and their diamonds and their gold and their coal and anything else of value we can find. But, that's not really why we're there. But it's really why we're there. Shh, don't tell people. All right? Now, did the African people just go, oh, okay, here you are. I guess you can come in? No, not really. There was a lot of conflict in Africa as a result of this. One of the significant spots of resistance, and you may have heard this, they've made movies about it. Shaka Zulu led the Zulu tribe against British rule in the early 1800s and had varying levels of success there, but ultimately neither side got really what they wanted. You had the Boer Wars, and that was actually fought between the Dutch settlers in South Africa area and the British in the 1890s, and that was actually the second Boer War. I'm not really going to spend a lot of time talking about the Boer Wars because that could be a whole lesson into itself. That was almost 100 years of conflict between the Dutch and the British. And of course, when you have these two powers fighting each other, local residents, natives residents there are kind of being drawn into this conflict, and you're being forced to join one side or the other or get steamrolled if you don't. But that is huge, and I'm not going to take the time to talk about it today, but if you're bored and you want to get information, read up on the Boer Wars, study the Boer Wars. All right. You also have Emperor Menelik II. When we talked about Ethiopia in the earlier slide, he successfully defended Ethiopia against invasion in 1896. One of the very few African cultures to resist imperialism. He fought the Italians. It was the Italians that were trying to take over that area. And they just weren't successful in taking that area over. Menelik resisted them, and good for him. So, a lot of conflict in Africa, but just at the end of the day, the technology differences were just too strong. When you've got guns and cannons and all these things and mechanized vehicles, it's hard to resist those, no matter how brave you are, no matter how strong your culture is. It's just really hard to resist that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and end today. This is the part one. This is about Africa. We are going to get into Asia in part two. Although if you want to go ahead, I will be uploading this presentation to the Google Classroom. You can go through it all. But I will, in part two of this, go over some of the things going on in Asia. And I'll upload that probably tomorrow or Wednesday. Anyway, kiddos, I know this was long. We've been, recording for almost 30 minutes. That was about my target goal, so we're good on that. Feel free to comment in the comment section about any questions you might have about this, and I will do my best to answer. Check the Google Classroom site. It will have information there on this and have that worksheet. And you can communicate either through the Google Classroom or through the comments here. You all have a wonderful day. I will talk to you soon. And again, I wish I had the opportunity to present this to you in the classroom. And I miss you guys. So hang in there. Reach out to me with whatever you need. Peace. If anyone has a hidden immunity idol and would like to play it, now would be the time to do so.